السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. نحمده ونصلي على رسوله الكريم. أما بعد. Continuing the discussion about the relationship and the dealing of the Prophet ﷺ with his wives. We come towards the end of this chapter. And this is a very important thing that we all need to pay attention to, which is the way the Prophet ﷺ would be forgiving when it came to sometimes the wives of the Prophet ﷺ would maybe raise their voices or become upset with the Prophet ﷺ. And so the Prophet ﷺ was very soft with them and was very forgiving with them. And so we see, for example, in a hadith that's narrated by Nu'man ibn Bashir radiallahu anhuma, that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, one time he happened to be coming to the house of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, in which Aisha radiallahu anha was also staying, and he happened to hear that Aisha radiallahu anha had raised her voice to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And and then that's while he was already knocking to go inside the house. So then the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam let him inside the house, and he came inside. He said, "Oh, daughter of Ruman," talking to Aisha radiallahu anha, meaning my daughter. And then he held on to her, meaning telling her, "How are you raising your voice to the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam?" And what did the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam replied? The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he came in between Aisha radiallahu anha and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then he basically to try to make her happy. He said, "Look, didn't you see how I came between you and the man?" Meaning your father, as if saying I'm protecting you from your father, right? And in this way, then she became happy and she calmed down. And then Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, he left and then he came back. And then he found that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was joking around and having fun with Aisha radiallahu anha. And so then he asked for permission to come, and he came. And then Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu said, "Just like you have shared your war with me, now also share your peace with me." Meaning, that time where you were into an argument and you let me be a part of it, also let me be part of your joking as well. So you see the beautiful character of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? Now just imagine, if there's any man in the entire universe who has the right to say that I'm the Prophet of Allah, how dare you raise your voice to me, then it is the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Whereas if one of us who have a much lower status of the Prophet ﷺ, if something like this ever happens, then we feel like it's the end of the world. That how could my spouse raise their voice like this to me? I am her husband. She's doing this to me, and our anger becomes out of control, and we say, how could you do this? How could you disrespect me like this, etc. This and that. We look at the way the Prophet ﷺ dealt with matters. We see that he had the highest level of tolerance when it came to the dealing with his wives, radiallahu ta'ala anhunna. And so we see that where does this come from? How is he able to handle it so much? It is because of his extreme humility and his humbleness that the Prophet ﷺ had, and also his hilm, his forbearance that he had, that whenever anybody did something to him, he was very able to bear it in a very great manner. Sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And there's a few other examples of this as well. For example, there's even an example of a couple of the wives. They were arguing in front of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and one of the dishes broke, and there were some guests there in the house as well. And so this was obviously a situation that brings embarrassment. Yet the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't shout at them and yell at them that how could you do all this in front of me, and then on top of that in front of these guests, right? Rather, he very quietly just took care of the situation and calmed everybody, right? And then also there's the situation one time the Umar radiallahu an, one time Umar radiallahu an, he said that one time my wife, she raised her voice against me, and I got extremely upset. This is something that I never ever saw from her. And he also mentioned that the women of Quraysh, they were very much calm, soft, and they would never raise their voices against their husbands. Whereas women of the Ansar, they tended to be a little bit more in this regard with raising their voices against their husbands. And so she said that basically our wives started taking from the character of the wives of the women of Medina. And so he said that I was shocked. How could she speak back to me, like talk back to me when we were talking, and she kind of is arguing back. This is something that he's not used to. This never happened before. So she said he said, how could you do this, right? And then she replied, but how can you deny? How can you tell me that? Why are you doing this? When the wives of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam also, they respond back to him when they're discussing something, and they give a response back, right? To the point where sometimes one of them might get upset at the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and even stop talking to him for the rest of the day until the nighttime. So he was shocked that how could this happen? So then he immediately went to the Prophet first went to Hafsa radiallahu anha, who's his own daughter, who's also the wife of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he said that, do you talk back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? She said, yes. And he replied, and do one of you, the wives, they sometimes stop talking to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam until the nighttime? And he said, yes. And he was obviously very, very astonished and shocked, and he scolded her, etc. And then after this, he went to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and there was a whole discussion. But the point over here is that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he bore it patiently. However, it's also important to note that it also has its limits, right? And so there was a point where the Prophet ﷺ actually left his wives for an entire month, and he stopped speaking to him completely, to the point where he was even living in a separate a room that the Prophet ﷺ was staying in. And it was due to a certain incident that had happened, and some verses in Surah Ahzab were revealed about this, in which in the end Allah gave the wives of the Prophet ﷺ an ultimatum that, because they basically had gotten together and said, we want more nafaqah, we want more of an allowance from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this was something that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam got extremely upset over. And so the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam left them for a month, right? He did not divorce them, but it was so long that the rumor started spreading in Medina that, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam has divorced all of his wives. And Umar radiallahu anhu was extremely shocked, because his own daughter was one of the wives of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he found it wasn't a divorce, but he had left them for some time. And then we see that in the end, the situation got better, and the Prophet ﷺ forgave them, and they also obviously sought forgiveness from the Prophet ﷺ. But we see ultimately the balance, right? Again, just to highlight that over here, I'm not encouraging that the wives or the husband, they should be yelling at each other, and they should be arguing in that manner. But naturally, there's something that happens in a relationship. So how should we deal with it when it does happen? At the same time, we also have to put down limits, and sometimes using our discretion, using our judgment, there has to be some sort of limits that are set. And of course, this is something that you have to maybe sit with the ulama, or study the life of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and see that what were these limits and how to deal with the wives. This is obviously a much deeper topic, but just to put this thought out in front of us, that at the very least we should be as tolerating as possible to our wives, and even if some slight pushback comes from our wife, we shouldn't be so angry and upset that, who is she to talk to me like this? Rather, we should look at the way the Prophet ﷺ dealt with these situations and follow the character of the Prophet ﷺ in these regards. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us all tawfiq wa akhir da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Subhanallah bihamdi, subhanakallahumma bihamdik. Nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka.